Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Tisha B'Av Rabbis panel. I'm Rabbi Anibal Mas from Congregation Shaarei Zedek, and on behalf of the Winnipeg Council of Rabbis, I would like to welcome you to the 2021 edition of the Tisha B'Av Rabbis panel. The topic for this discussion will center around what does Tisha B'Av means to me, to us, today. Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the Hebrew month of Av, is been traditionally an annual fast day in Judaism, on which a number of disasters in Jewish history occurred. Primarily, the destruction of both the first and second temples. Tisha B'Av is regarded as the saddest day on the Jewish calendar. Joining me this morning, we have Rabbi Yossi Ben Rosh from Adas Yeshurun Herzliya congregation, Rabbi Alan Finkel from Temple Shalom, Rabbi Kliel Rose from Congregation Etz Chaim. I'm about to welcome our rabbis, if you give me a second. We have Rabbi Ben Rosh. Rabbi Yossi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I cannot see you, but I can hear you clear, loud and clear, actually.
Thank you.
Joining us all the way from Israel, right, Rabbi Yossi?
I am.
Okay. How was Tisha B'Av for you?
Tisha B'Av has gone very well so far. I'm not sure why you can't see me.
It's like you don't have the camera.
Yes, I do have it on, but okay.
You see, it's check if there is a little like a gear symbol below your image. That's the settings, and maybe there you have to choose the camera, or there is also an icon, almost like the Zoom one, that is like a camera. Maybe it's off in your computer. Who knows? Meanwhile, I would like to welcome some of our viewers. We have Claudette Hale. Hi, Claudette, welcome. And Karen Farkas is also here. Wishing you all the best to you too. And Rabbi Alan Finkel is joining us. Shalom, Rabbi. How are you doing?
Doing very well, thank you. And I just got a message from Rabbi Kliel that he'll be on in about 2 minutes.
Okay, sounds fantastic. So it looks like we will be able to start our panel pretty soon, our discussion. But I don't know if it's going to be a discussion or more like to share with everybody different interpretations, perhaps, of Tisha B'Av. It's something that's been around for 2,000 years. And I will say that every generation will add further teachings to this special day, right? So, Rabbi Alan, you were great yesterday introducing the Megillah. How did you feel?
It's interesting, as I'll describe momentarily. I'm conflicted about Tisha B'Av, so I think it was very appropriate that I think you stuck me in the middle of this whole thing. I'm saying it in a very kind way, because I think there really is that sense of needing to be very, very open-minded when it comes to the idea of how we understand Torah, how we understand our traditions, and always to find a way to make it meaningful for us today. So I'm very glad that we've chosen to approach this topic in this kind of way.
And now we can see Rabbi Yossi Ben Rosh.
Thank you.
So perhaps you want to share with us, Rabbi, how is Tisha B'Av a little bit in Israel? Because it's not that somebody told you. You're there.
Yeah.
So nobody better than you to share with everybody what you experienced.
Well, first of all, I'm going to say that the fast is 2 hours earlier than it is in Winnipeg. So that's a good thing. It ends here at about 8:15, whereas in Winnipeg, I think it's about 10:15. But really, it's quite remarkable here, because every step you take here, you can actually feel sometimes the remnants of the destruction of the temple. Where we live here in Efrat, we're a little far away from things, but as you venture into Jerusalem, it's really quite remarkable. And I've done this, and you see people literally, for example, on promenades that overlook the temple area, and they're all lined on the street, sitting on the ground, and reading the Kinot, the Eicha, and so you kind of get a real sense of what was as you close your eyes and you imagine what was and what was destroyed. On the other hand, I have to say that as you look around Israel and you see this beautiful country so rebuilt and so populated, and you look at the city of Jerusalem. On the other hand, you also realize that maybe some of the rebuilding has already started taking place. So it's kind of a very kind of mixed feeling that you get on Tisha B'Av here.
Wow. I hope you have more to say when it's your turn to present for the panel.
I do.
I should warn you that I warned everybody that we're doing this alphabetically by last name. He will be starting very soon.
Oh.
Well, that's actually good, because actually here it's already I think almost 7 o'clock in the afternoon here, and we have mincha literally in about 20 minutes from now.
Okay, so and Rabbi Kliel is here as well.
Yes.
Rabbi Kliel, you're not smiling. That's not you.
Weird.
How are you doing? How are you doing, Rabbi Kliel?
I apologize. I had something really important came up, and so I apologize for running a little bit late. But I wish I had Rabbi Ben Rosh's excuse. I have to run to. I was late because of Mincha, but it's not the case. So, yeah.
Okay. So now that we are all here, we have something to share with everybody that they're watching, and is what Tisha B'Av means to each one of us. Before we do that, I would also like to welcome to Jerome Fomin and Bel Jarniewski, that they say hello in the chat. I don't know, Rabbis, if you can see the chat there in front of you. You can see all the messages. So for everybody who is watching, if you want to send messages to us, if you want to communicate with the four of us or between yourself, use the chat. The chat is open both on Facebook and YouTube. So who wants to go first? We didn't decide that.
I thought that I was going to go first.
Okay. Rabbi Ben Rosh, it's your turn.
Okay, so first of all, thank you, Rabbi Anibal, for hosting this, and I just wanted to first of all apologize to everybody just from the start that I'm going to have to leave a little bit early. As I mentioned, I am in Israel, and here it's about 6:45 now, and we have mincha in, I think it's about 20 minutes or so is mincha time, so I will have to leave early. But I just wanted to first of all share with everybody. I think Tisha B'Av is one of those days that's hard for a lot of people to kind of connect to, something that happened so many thousands of years ago. But in fact, I think this is one of the most important parts of being Jewish, and that is our remembrance of our history. And if we don't know our history, how can we move forward? Tisha B'Av, as Rabbi Mas said, is but it is the saddest day of the Jewish year, where the rabbis have pointed out to many calamities. Two of them, of course, are the destructions of our two temples, but there were many other things that happened on Tisha B'Av. For example, our rabbis say that that's the day that the spies, during the story of in the Torah, where the spies came back and spoke badly about the land of Israel, and the Jewish people had to now journey for 40 years in the wilderness. So it's a sad day. It's a day that we remember destruction. But what I wanted to talk about is actually the exact opposite, because there's something very unique about the way we Jews remember destruction. We remember it, we mourn it, but at the same time, Tisha B'Av is a day that's filled with tremendous amount of hope. And so I would call the day of Tisha B'Av not only the day of tragedy, but the day that goes from tragedy to hope. And I just want to show you a couple of examples of this. There's a prayer that we say every single day in our morning prayers and also in the afternoon prayers. It's the prayer of Tachanun. It's said immediately after the Shmona Esrei, the Amida. And the prayer of Tachanun is considered to be a very sad prayer. And as a result of that, we do not say Tachanun on happy days. For example, on Shabbat, we don't say Tachanun. On Rosh Chodesh, on holidays, Pesach, Shavuot, all the Jewish holidays, because they are happy days, we omit Tachanun. So one would think that the prayer of Tachanun should be front and center in our Tisha B'Av prayers. We should say it for sure on Tisha B'Av. Comes along Jewish law and tells us we omit saying Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. How can this be? How could it be possible that the prayer that is only omitted on happy days is omitted on the 9th of Av? And the rabbis explain that in Megillat Eicha, Lamentations, they tell us that there is a verse that's referring to the destruction of the temple, and it says, Kara alai mo'ed. The day of Tisha B'Av is also called, in the name of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, it's also called a mo'ed. And what is a mo'ed? A mo'ed is a festival. It's a holiday. And so therefore, we omit saying Tachanun on Tisha B'Av. What's the holiday that we're celebrating here? We're remembering the destruction of the temple. So there's an interesting Talmud. The Gemara says that on Tisha B'Av, the temples were destroyed, but on Tisha B'Av is the day that the Mashiach will be born. If anybody is born on the day of Tisha B'Av, you are a candidate perhaps to be the Mashiach. By the way, I celebrate today the birth of my youngest, actually not my youngest, but one of my youngest grandchildren. One of my grandchildren was actually born on Tisha B'Av. We always kibitz with him that maybe he will be the Mashiach. So this is a remarkable teaching, that on one hand, we remember destruction, but on the other hand, we have the hope that the Mashiach will be born on the day of Tisha B'Av. There's a beautiful Sephardic custom, and me being a Sephardic Jew, I like to share, our beautiful customs. There's a very beautiful Sephardic custom that on the day of Tisha B'Av in the afternoon, which already it is here in Israel, there was a custom of the Sephardic women to clean their houses. They would mop the floors, they would sweep the floors, they would clean the house, they would make it right, literally spick and span clean. And why did they do that? They did it because they knew that Mashiach, the Messiah, was coming right now, was going to come on Tisha B'Av. And they said, how could it be possible? Of course, the Mashiach, if he comes, he's going to come to my house. And if my house is dirty on Tisha B'Av, what kind of a show of respect would that be to the Mashiach? And so therefore they were filled with this tremendous amount of hope that the redemption could happen at any moment. And as a result of that, they wanted to be ready for the Mashiach. I'm just going to tell you one last story. If you've ever been to the city of Tzfat, and actually my wife and I, we were just there, I think 4 days ago, there's actually a beautiful little street. In fact, I think that at one point it was even in the Guinness World Book of Records as the smallest and shortest street in the world. And it's called in Hebrew, Sintat HaMashiach, the alleyway of the Mashiach. And why is it called the alleyway of the Mashiach? Well, this woman is no longer alive anymore, but many, many years ago, there was an old Sephardic woman who lived there, and every single day she would prepare a cup of tea and make a little cake, and she would put it out at the courtyard of her house in front of the door. And when people would walk by and ask her, why are you putting a piece of cake and a glass of tea in front of your door? She would answer, because the Mashiach could come any day. And of course, he's going to come to my house. And how is it possible? Just like any good Jewish woman, right? And that how could it be possible that if the Mashiach would come to my house, I wouldn't have a piece of cake and a glass of tea ready for the Mashiach? I have to be ready every single day. I want you all to appreciate. And so therefore, they called this little street, this little alleyway, the alleyway of Mashiach. I want you to appreciate the kind of faith, the kind of hope that people were filled with, that they felt that redemption was literally seconds away. And not only was it in their minds, but it was something that they actually prepared for. They actually cleaned their houses. They actually prepared tea and a piece of cake. They did something because they were so filled with this faith that the Mashiach, that the redemption could come at any moment. And so for me, I mourn the destruction of our temples. I realized that something very, very important was taken away from us. Something very important was destroyed, and not to mention the hundreds of thousands of Jews that were killed during the destruction. It literally was a Holocaust that is far, far away in time, but nevertheless very, very close in our memories. So I mourn all of those things, but at the same time, I realize that the rabbis wanted to fill us with also a message of hope and realize that redemption is close by. And here in Israel, I have to tell you all, as I walk the streets and I see how developed this beautiful country is, and I see what we've done here to build this country that was just swamps not a long time ago, I realize that those steps are very, very close. And I realize that we should be filled with a tremendous amount of hope. So I leave you all with that message, the message of remembrance, but also the message of hope. And that's why when we had to write a national anthem, the national anthem that we wrote was Hatikva. That is the life of a Jew, to remember some of the difficult times we were in, but also to be filled with a sense of hope that the future will be bright for all of us. So I wish you all very good rest of the day, a good fast, a meaningful fast to all of you. And I'm going to turn the microphone back to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Yossi. Beautiful, beautiful message. And actually, I have to go and edit mine now because we have some overlap. That's the problem of not going first. No, but I think I really appreciate that. And just a question, because you are there more than any of us in Israel. Have you ever tried to picture yourself in a time where the temple is actually there? Can you imagine in a way that you can say, I feel it in my kishkes? Sorry to use a Yiddish expression with a Sephardic rabbi, but you know what I mean. That you are actually participating in a temple service. Have you ever had that thought?
I actually have had that thought, and I've had some very powerful. I think the first time I ever visited Israel, it was just after I was a graduate from Joseph Linsky Collegiate. I had done 1 year at University of Manitoba, and then I came for 6 months actually to Israel, and I'll never forget it. It was Yom HaAtzmaut, right? Israel's Independence Day, and I was with a friend, a fellow that I graduated also from Joseph Linsky Collegiate. And we were walking right outside the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, and we came to Brechot HaSultan, the Sultan's. I don't know how it's called in English even, but it's a little kind of like valleyway just outside the walls of the city, and there was a concert going on, and in that concert was the Israel Philharmonic. And all of a sudden, the Israel Philharmonic, and I was outside, the Israel Philharmonic started to play Hatikva. And I want to tell you that I had literally goosebumps all over my body to hear on Yom HaAtzmaut, standing right outside the walls of the city of Jerusalem, hearing Hatikva played by the Israel Philharmonic. And that's 2,000 years after our destruction and our exile. And here we were, standing here. And I closed my eyes for just a few moments, and I could just imagine what it was like living in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. And here we are now 2,000 years later, and the Israel Philharmonic playing Hatikva in the city of Jerusalem. That was probably the most powerful moment that I had of what it could be like to live in Jerusalem and see the city, just literally being rebuilt, in front of our eyes.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's I tried to do it once. Try to imagine myself in a time with the temple rebuilt, and the altar and the priest and the animals, and I realized how far away we are from that it makes it virtually impossible to fully picture how that could be. So, but I'm still once in a while dream about it and try to place myself. I said,
Right.
who knows, right?
Well, we say Hayinu kecholmin. We are like dreamers.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rabbi Yossi.
Thank you.
Beautiful words. And yeah, really appreciate it. You can see the chat there. People really like what you have to say. Rabbi Alan, you're gonna go next. I see Rabbi Cleel's camera is not on.
Apparently it's me. So thank you so much, Rabbi Yossi. Thank you so much for your words. What a great start to the morning. I really appreciate the stories you've described about the experience in Israel. I certainly remember the first time I heard Hatikva in Israel. It was in my last trip, and the particular experience was on Yom HaZikaron in a moshav, and the whole and thinking of all the people who built the land at that time. You know, the displays they had of all the people in their communities that they had lost over the last 50 or 60 years. You know, friends and family members. And I remember again too, out of the terrible pain of even the building of Israel and the maintenance of Israel, to see how important Hatikva was to them as well. So that story really brought back memories, of course. So thank you for those words. So as always, it's a real pleasure for me to sit on a rabbi's panel with my colleagues, for the Winnipeg Council of Rabbis. For me, it's not as much about my ability to pass on my views as it is for me the opportunity to listen and to learn and to hear new perspectives that open up my mind and my understanding as well. It's one of the wonderful things about our council that we really are sharing viewpoints across the entire Jewish religious spectrum, and we're sharing these things very respectfully, and we're listening with a lot of curiosity. And I think this is really an extraordinary experience for me to have been welcomed into this community in that kind of way. So, as I mentioned, just as we were coming online, I do have a tricky relationship with Tisha B'Av, largely because Reform Judaism has a tricky relationship with this day, and because I've grown up in two distinctive Jewish worlds, each offering a distinctive perspective. I grew up, of course, in an Orthodox environment in the North End of Winnipeg with the traditional view, as Rabbi Yossi described so well, as a fast day, mourning our terrible losses, especially the destruction of the Second Temple, which effectively separated us from our religious and spiritual center, and largely from the land of Israel. So for me, finding Reform Judaism 30 years ago, I was then exposed to a very different take on Tisha B'Av, largely driven by a new movement that started 200 years ago that was looking to establish itself in the modern world rather than looking to the past. This new movement, first in Germany and then Western Europe and then into the United States, was quite radical for its time. Among other things, early Reform rabbis who had themselves been trained as traditional rabbis declared that after 1800 years, we were no longer in mourning for what was now a lost way of life. This new movement held that we were no longer committed to the rebuilding of the temple, or in restoring the priestly classes, the Kohanim and the Leviim, or in bringing back sacrifices. And this led to two changes: the restoration of music and instruments inside the sanctuaries again on Shabbat and the holidays, just like in temple days, and the diminishment of Tisha B'Av as a fast day or a day of mourning. So like I said, Tisha B'Av is tricky for me. Fortunately, Reform Judaism allows each individual to find personal meaning in all of our traditions. And in recent years, even Tisha B'Av is again open for discussion within our movement. And I have started to find personal meanings that I will share with you. Oddly enough, my evolving thoughts about Tisha B'Av have been shaped by the relatively recent addition of another Jewish holiday to our Hebrew calendar, Yom HaShoah, our Holocaust Memorial Day, which was first passed by the Israeli Knesset in 1959, just over 60 years ago. It is a powerful day, a reminder of a specific and very recent tragedy with an impact that we are still trying to process today. But as we know from our study of Jewish history, calamities have been part of our history all the way through. Not just in the 5 events described by the Mishnah in around 200 CE that included the destruction of our 2 temples, and as Rabbi Yossi mentioned, the 10 spies of Israel, and the raising of the destruction of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and the raising of the temple itself in 135 CE. But we're also talking about the almost 2,000 years that have followed us into our dispersion into the diaspora. We can readily think of the terrible acts perpetrated on Rabbi Akiva and his followers, our many, many martyrs through the ages, the Crusades, the pogroms in virtually every country across Europe and Russia, the Inquisition, blood libels and riots, expulsions over and over again in so many countries, and the repression and persecution of Jews then and now all across the world. So I find myself taking a more expansive view of Tisha B'Av, rooting it far less with the losses suffered 2,000 years ago, but in all the losses we as a Jewish people have suffered. In many ways, for me, Tisha B'Av is our Holocaust Remembrance Day writ large, a historical marker of our hugely challenged journey as a Jewish people over the past 3,000 years. So how would I approach this expanded idea of Tisha B'Av? Again, I come back to Yom HaShoah, or more accurately to its full name, Yom HaZikaron L'Shoah V'Lagvura, Holocaust and Heroism Remembrance Day. In modern times, even with the loss of 6 million Jews, men, women, and children, the new state of Israel made the explicit decision in 1959, only 14 years later, that this could not be a day of lamentation. The legislation passed by the Knesset was called the Martyrs and Heroes Remembrance Day, with the purpose of instituting an annual commemoration of the disaster which the Nazis and their collaborators brought upon the Jewish people, and the acts of heroism and revolt performed. We had to move on. We had to find hope and moments of courage and not sit in a morass of grief and lamentation. And for me, this frames what Tisha B'Av might look like, a day when we acknowledge our huge losses, but also a day when we can mark our incredible resiliency as a people. Just like our Yom HaShoah marks those who fought back against all odds, so too can Tisha B'Av mark all those who throughout our history found a way out from under the fire and ashes of our worst days as a Jewish people. As horrific as the destruction of the Second Temple was, and how worthy it is of our lament, it was that act by the Romans that led to a rebirth and a renaissance of our people in surprising ways. The extraordinary rise of Rabbinic Judaism, the codification of the Mishnah so soon after, the extraordinary collaborations that created the Talmud, and a long history of brilliant rabbis that followed. And then there was the introduction of prayer and synagogues that could follow us and be the center of our Jewish communities all around the world, wherever we lived. These are acts of gevurah, of strength and heroism and of resiliency that I see within Tisha B'Av as well. I have to admit that for many of these reasons, I do struggle personally with Echa, the Book of Lamentations, which is recited on Tisha B'Av. As beautiful as the poetry is, and as exquisitely mournful is the trope used to chant Echa, I do struggle with its liturgy in modern times. The idea that Jerusalem and the First Temple were destroyed by God because our Jewish people had sinned, and that our redemption and the restoration of Zion would only happen once we repented and returned to the right path. It would be easy to suggest that my struggles are because I'm a Reformed Jew, but I think it is something different. Certainly the God of Echa is reminiscent of the God of the fifth book of the Torah, Devarim, or the book of Deuteronomy, God offering blessings or curses to the entire nation of Israel, depending on our compliance with God's laws as expressed in the Torah. But that idea of God is terrifying for me in modern times, as it is the same type of argument that suggests that we Jews deserve the Holocaust because we had strayed from God. It is an argument advanced by some in our world Jewish community, but I simply can't accept that argument as the son of a Holocaust survivor. My mother lost too many first cousins and second cousins, babies, and little children for that to be possible. In the 1950s, the chief rabbi of Israel and the Knesset declined to go down the path of lamentation for the Holocaust. And I am similarly disinclined to choose Echa as the defining theology for the calamities that have befallen us then and now. Today, on the 9th of Av, I choose to pause and recall all that has fallen upon us, but also to acknowledge how we have responded, how we've reacted, how we have grown in spite of and because of all those calamities. Today, as I read Torah, I see that our Torah describes many ideas of what God might be, beyond the punishing God of Deuteronomy and Echa. Later this evening, as we read the prayer Ahavat Olam, I see God's loving gift of the Torah to us as God's people. And in the Torah, I see the idea of God expressed in so many other ways that allow each of us to find an idea of God that works for us. Today, I'm thankful and grateful for a loving and caring God that ensured that we, as Am Yisrael, the nation of Israel, have always had the spiritual nourishment, the gevurah, the strength and resiliency to move forward despite our calamities, where we can say on this day, Am Yisrael Chai. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Alan. And wow, it's always interesting to hear other interpretations of the same story. Your interpretation of Echa, I think, is very thought-provoking. The theology, let's say, behind Echa is very interesting. It's very interesting. I'm wondering if that theology actually, the traditional theology of Echa, right? The one that it's God's action. If it brings comfort to some people, that idea. What do you think?
Something. Part of my journey away from Orthodox Judaism was because I struggled with this particular vision of God. These are very, very personal understandings, and I think Rabbi Anibal, you and I both teach Intro to Judaism courses, and you spend a lot of time talking about theology. And to me, the most important thing is to find what works for each of us. So I personally struggled with the idea of a punishing God. As a child, I knew I needed something different. And I know that I often talk with my students and say one of the things we do as Jews is we talk about everything about Judaism, but we very rarely talk to each other about what God means. It's because we're afraid we got it wrong. And it's but I actually, what I do is I empower people to find the one that works for them, and I present many, many different visions. So I think this is part of it, as I'm talking about what I'm reading here. This is my personal story of my relationship with God and what I needed, and I really am not trying to impose this on anybody else. I have found ways of making God relevant in my life, but not necessarily. As I said, we look through the Torah, there's just so many magical ways that God is described to us. Using human words to describe something which is invisible, ineffable, insubstantial. So I think it's really a question of how we basically view the world in which we choose what we need. But as I said, it's one of the things that kind of nudged me away. And I don't want to say it's consistent with Orthodox Judaism. It was the Judaism of the particular shul that I went to that I struggled with. And that's the one that became the dominant set of values that represented me when I was younger. So in many respects, Tisha B'Av represents a microcosm. But as in actually looking at this session today, I was really encouraged to go not just what I was, but why was I there and where do I need to go personally? So I think these are all personal journeys we have. And I think when we talk with each other as rabbis and with this broader community, we can bring forth those individual voices and empower us to find what we need theologically, halachically, ritually, values-wise to express ourselves as Jews.
Yeah, it's my point is when I hear you talking about God the way you did, it sounds very logical, right? It's like, I would say, a rational approach, but we've been having like an alternative theology for thousands of years. And sometimes it's interesting to see how that alternative theology works so well for certain people. The concept of...
One of the advantages we have, I think certainly in the Reform and Conservative tradition share one thing in common. That's we take a historical contextual view of the Torah. We don't necessarily believe it was written al pi Adonai b'yad Moshe, that kind of thing, that God wrote it, so God spoke it and Moses wrote it in 1300 BCE. So when we do those things, we also know that this particular author of the Book of Lamentations would have lived at a certain period of time surrounded by his, I'm assuming it's his values at that particular time. And we know that many of the books in the Torah were assembled at different times with the influences of cultures around them. There's many names of God, the same kinds of ideas as well. So I think we do have those options of basically with the Torah of always choosing what we need, because even the views of God are not necessarily consistent all the way through. Different authors have written it through the many books of the Torah in very different kinds of ways. If you take a look at the Yechezkel and others, just very different understandings. So we just go to where we have to go.
Absolutely. And that's what I think when I hear, for example, the expression Shivim Panim LaTorah. The Torah has 70 faces. And it's something that we just read in the Torah, right? Before the crossing of the Jordan. They say that Rashi understands that Moses translated the Torah into 70 languages. But I read one comment that it should not be understood as 70 languages, but 70 situations. Like thinking in the future, in the sense that Moses already realized that the Torah will be interpreted differently, depends on the context, depends on the situation. So he almost already prophetically narrated the Torah in 70 different ways. And it's exactly what I'm seeing in every generation, that even Tisha B'Av, and how it has a little bit of different meaning to each one of us, different situations, different places, different generations. So thank you so much, Rabbi Alan, for your insights. It's beautiful. And Rabbi Kliel, before we continue, actually, I have to extend the apologies from Rabbi Yossi Ben Arosh, that he had to leave because in Israel, he was needed for the Mincha service. It's something very important, so that's why he went first. He needed to take his obligation to daven Mincha with the minyan.
I was also going to add in one other thing. I got regards from Rabbi Matthew, who is part of the Winnipeg Council of Rabbis. He's traveling in Ontario. He upgraded from a sort of maybe show up, from no to sort of maybe, and he said this morning he won't be attending. He's traveling with his family, having a wonderful time, and he would have been a wonderful voice to add as well. But he does pass on his best wishes to us as the rabbis and to our community as well on this day.
Thank you, Rabbi Alan. So, Rabbi Kliel, it's you and me. Who do you want to go first?
I thought we were going in alphabetical order. So, and then I thought maybe we're going by age, but I think Rabbi Finkel's older than Rabbi Ben Arosh. Yeah, he doesn't look it. Let me just say that.
So if you want, I can go first and you can wrap it up.
That would be great. Thanks.
Okay. So let me tell you that when I think about Tisha B'Av, or what Tisha B'Av means to me, the first thing that comes to me is the fact that the Talmud attempts to understand why Jerusalem and the temples were destroyed, and why we have to endure such long exile. And the interesting thing, I love this thing about the Talmud, that they always try to find the why. And many answers were presented. And all the way, as Rabbi Ben Arosh explained, the explanations were all the way from the story of the 10 spies in biblical times to the actual behavior of the Jewish people during the times of the destruction of the first and second temple. Okay? So let's back up and think, what could it be so bad from those behaviors, the spies, the people during the times of the temple? What could be so bad as to trigger such tragedies? So let's go by parts. The story of the spies is teaching us about a group of leaders that not only failed to realize that they were part of God's plan to bring the Israelites into the promised land, but they also executed a plan to demoralize the entire nation of Israel. So it's almost like it wasn't enough for them to fail. They pushed everyone else to failure as well. So to me, as a leader, I take this very seriously on Tisha B'Av. As leaders, I believe we have to realize that our actions have consequences beyond our lives. I believe we all have mentors sometimes. That's how we became leaders, right? And sometimes we are lucky that we learn from them and from others what to do by emulating their exemplary lives. But sometimes we learn from other people exactly the opposite. We learn about what not to do by looking at their lives, right? So in this case, when I look at the story of the 12 spies, as a leader, I feel like I'm looking at other leaders, and I learn, or I should learn, exactly what not to do in this generation. So what I learned from this story year after year is that our mission as leaders is not to demoralize, condemn, or embarrass people for what they do or they don't do, but to uplift them and help them to become all what God created them to be. So that's one thing that I learned every Tisha B'Av and what Tisha B'Av means to me. But there is something else that I want to share with you, because sometimes it doesn't matter our good intentions. In fact, we are going to fail many times. Sometimes we fail big times, but nevertheless, we need to stay positive. When we cry about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, both symbolizing a perfect world and a perfect society, we should also realize that according to the rabbis, the Messiah will be born on Tisha B'Av. The Messiah meaning hope for the future. So, you see, failure, tragedy, sometimes has the ability to paralyze us. And we need to be able to overcome failure and tragedy and find ways to move forward. So, Tisha B'Av, yes, it reminds me of the destruction of the temple, but it also reminds me, for example, the story of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who witnessed the destruction, but did not give up and redoubled his plan to create a yeshiva in the city of Yavne, to share hope, to uplift, and to plan a future without the temple. It was a fact. The temple was not there anymore. So what now? We quit? Judaism is over? Or we find a way to overcome and to move forward? So there is so much tragedy encapsulated on Tisha B'Av, and yet at the same time, there is so much hope shared by amazing people who generation after generation remind us that no matter how low we fall, there is always a way to bounce back and keep dreaming on a perfect world and a perfect society. And that's what I wanted to share with each one of you. That's the way I look at Tisha B'Av every year. Sometimes I don't necessarily cry for a building or for a city, but for what that building or that city represents. And just try to move forward and to keep uplifting people all around, because that, I believe, is the mission of every leader. So there you go. So thank you so much. And back to my colleagues.
Yasher koach.
Ruchtia, thank you, Rabbi. And it's interesting because as I was talking, I wasn't paying attention to the chat. So, Rabbi Kliel, would like to share with us your reflection?
Yeah, and I feel like in many ways, the downside of being the last person is that you're going to end up repeating some of what's already been said. And how could we not repeat what's been said? I think we forget how much we have in common with one another. And so if I say things that have already been said, I'm not going to apologize. It's just that I need to say it in my voice, and it needs to be said by others in their voice. So, but I want to start just with an apology for arriving a little bit late. There was something I had to take care of that was of real importance. So, as much as I want to just recognize that Tisha B'Av is a moment where you have to embrace it, sometimes life functions and gets in the way. So, all of that being said, it's really an honor for me to be here. I know Rabbi Allen has said it, and Rabbi Ben Rosh and Rabbi Mas, but it's just been such a delight getting to know the rabbis in this particular community. And it's not to say you don't see their faces right now, but it's not to say that we always agree on everything. In fact, there are moments where we disagree, but what's great about that is that we're each able to articulate our opinions in a very respectful and coherent fashion. And I hope that becomes a model for how we conduct ourselves as a group of rabbis, and perhaps it'll have some influence on the rest of the community as well. So here are my thoughts. These are some what I would call random musings. And I can't help but begin my time here with memories. I'm very fortunate that I was immersed in Jewish life from the time I was born, and so I have amazing positive memories of all aspects of Jewish life, but in particular with Tisha B'Av. I remember going to shul with my father at the Talmud Torah for Tisha B'Av and sitting on the floor. And then, of course, I remember being in Jerusalem when I was 8. My parents were on sabbatical, and that was just to be at the Kotel, the Western Wall, and Tisha B'Av was pretty special. But I want to go back to a memory where I was 11, and I went to a modern Orthodox camp in Ontario, Camp Moshava, and there the experiences on Tisha B'Av, there's nothing like a Jewish camp setting. It just, those memories penetrate and stay with you for a lifetime. And I can recall as a young child, maybe about 11, the first time I was in this environment for Tisha B'Av, and we were all the campers were taken to the lakefront, and the older campers had built this wooden structure. I don't know if I've shared this before, but they built this wooden structure, and it just dawned on me, there wasn't anybody talking, but it looked almost like pictures of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple I had seen throughout my education at Talmud Torah. And then the next thing I know, this wooden structure is placed on a dock on the water, and some person brings over a huge torch, and they light this structure on fire, and the older campers push the structure slowly down the water, and it just floated down. And it was it's an image that will stay with me for a lifetime. Yeah, and I bring that up because I find that in my hyper rational mind as an adult, it's very hard for me to think or commemorate the notion of a lost edifice, of a lost physical structure. I think Rabbi Mas mentioned it. For me, what I commemorate and what I mourn is the loss of what the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, represented in terms of harmony and community unity. And so that's really what I long for, is that return. I'm not so fixated on the physical structure, although like Rabbi Mas and others, I've often wondered what it would have been like to live in the period of the Beit HaMikdash. So my longing is a little bit different. And I want to bring in this whole notion of memory, that memory is not a myth. It seems to me that especially on Tisha B'Av, that we must remember the darkest events of Jewish history that were experienced by Jews who were fundamentally like us. And many of you know that historians suggest that after the destruction of the Second Temple and the crushing of the Jewish revolt by Rome, the number of Jews who were forced into slavery was so high that the price of slaves dropped throughout the Roman Empire. Our tradition teaches us that some Jews refused to eat meat, drink wine, marry, or have children in the years that followed. There was an entire segment of the Jewish people simply gave up on life as they once knew it. However, the majority took a different path, and as the wonderful modern Orthodox theologian Rabbi Irving Greenberg, sometimes known as Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, once observed, the force behind Jewish survival has hardly been the strength of victory. He wrote, "The secret of survival has been the incredible capacity of Jews to use the memory of tragedy to spur themselves to come back again and again after defeat." And so to put it another way, the secret of Tisha B'Av lies not only in how we mourn on this day of loss, but in how we live Jewishly every day of the year. Of course, Jewish tragedy must be remembered as a step towards Jewish renewal. And Jewish renewal doesn't just happen on its own. It flows It occurs, it takes place from the values we prioritize and the daily choices we make as individual Jews and as a community. And so we review the darkest chapters of Jewish history so that we can fully appreciate what it means to live as a Jew now and in the world with a state of Israel. And we invest in our community, in building a strong community, because we know what it's like to have lost Jewish communities and have them destroyed throughout history over and over again. I want to go in a slightly different direction now and talk about this whole question of, I guess what we're asking is, does Tisha B'Av still matter? And I want to add to the question, given that there's a state of Israel, right? I am a proud Zionist. I am so grateful for the fact that there is a Jewish democratic state thriving. Do we still need to fast? And here's an interesting twist. Few of us have ever asked whether we are even permitted to do so now that there is a state of Israel. But I want to tell you that it's not a modern question. It's a question that's been asked for some time. So how do we understand the times we're living in and their ritual implications? How does the existence of the state of Israel impact our ongoing need or even permission to mourn for ancient Jerusalem? Should the resurgence of anti-Semitism shape our practice today? So while the Torah might suggest otherwise, should Tisha B'Av remain the catch-all day of mourning for temples, while the other days that we serve evolve into days of joy or gratitude for today's independent and resilient Jewish people? Or perhaps there is a middle ground, and this is something my teacher, Rabbi Adina Lewidis, has suggested, that invites people to spend the first half of Tisha B'Av in mournful fasting and reflection, and the second engage of acts of chesed, of loving kindness, and tikkun olam, social repair, building not a temple, but a world of love. So when to engage with memory and when to disengage are questions that percolate beyond Jewish observance. They inform societal narratives too. And the answers that shape the stories we tell about ourselves as a nation, the stories we bequeath to the next generation. Our personal lives, we wrestle with when to hold fast to the past as a source of comfort or inspiration, and when to surrender our emotional replays for the sake of forgiveness and renewal. So Jewish remembrance isn't only about recalling the past, it's about building the future. That's, I think, my overall message. Sometimes history and destiny is honored by ritualizing memories, and sometimes by letting go. So with that, I just want to wish everyone a meaningful Tisha B'Av fast. In whatever way you're marking this day of solemn remembrance, please remember that Jewish memory not only keeps us connected to where we've come from, it also helps us make the right choices about where we're headed. Toda Rabah.
Yashir Koyach, Rabbi Kliel. Very interesting question. Doesn't even make sense to continue with Tisha B'Av this date. It's a very good question, actually. Very good. And
yeah, is it okay if I add something, Rabbi Mas?
Absolutely.
What are you gonna do? Cut me off? Okay.
You know that I can't.
You can.
Don't say that because
you have the control button. That's right.
I'm the admin here, so
I should be very aware of that. Yeah. So you may know this in particular, but in Israel, it doesn's get a lot of press because Masorti, what we call conservative Judaism in Israel, is really so in the minority, as is the reform movement, although we're gaining more traction. But there are some prominent Masorti rabbis, conservative rabbis, this is already 25 years old, who have the custom, and really they're not a large group, so I don't want to mislead anybody, but they are so staunch in their belief in Zionism and the rebuilding of Jerusalem that they know their halachic and rabbinic sources so well. You know, I didn't have time to go into this, but there's all sorts of rabbinic sources that say it is a problem if Jerusalem is under Jewish sovereignty for us to continue to ritualize this day in the way that we continue to do so, that i.e. with a mournful perspective. And so, just to bring this to a close, these Masorti conservative rabbis are very dafka, they're very specific about stopping their fast right after Mincha on Tisha B'Av. So
yeah, Mincha Gedolah. That's my tradition. That's the way I was taught by my mentor, Rabbi Eduardo Weingarten in Chile. That's the way that was his tradition, and because I consider him my mentor, that's what I do.
Yeah, I was just to say, I know Rabbi Finkel once said something, but for the first time I saw this was at a Camp Ramah, part of the conservative movement, and I thought I was coming back from a year spent in a Orthodox yeshiva. I thought it was so heretical. But you know what? Over the years, it has made so much sense, and it elevates my connection to Israel when I've taken this approach, or at least thought about it. Yeah.
I was going to add something along the way about the fast day comments. I did some research for the presentation last night about the history of Tisha B'Av, and it was not always a fast day. It became a fast day probably starting around the 15th century. When there was real trauma in the Jewish community. It was a very, very sad day. Maimonides talks about not eating meat, for example, on the day. So there's an interesting evolution where it's picked up. This very, very dark timber of fasting is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in Judaism. It does not go back to biblical times. So I think it's kind of important to keep some of those contexts in place. That even Tisha B'Av, just as Judaism has evolved, so has Tisha B'Av, and it's become very heavily cloaked in rabbinic halakha, but it's not necessarily been the way for 2,000 years to have it as a fast day. So, I was really appreciating your comments for those reasons, is how do we continue to reinterpret these holidays for the times we live in? It has changed into a very, very dark day because of the heavy, heavy trauma of the Middle Ages on the Jewish communities in Europe and Asia.
Yeah, and also I think Rabbi Finkel, pardon me, Rabbi Allen. You know, it's my trajectory with bringing up a memory from camp was to go on to tell you that the next day at camp, we would then watch videos of the show that are historical documentaries about the Shoah, and then of course what you raised is the whole question about whether this solemn day, this catch-all day of memorial should also include the Shoah, and that was an argument, not in a negative way, but a debate within rabbis, Zionist rabbis in Israel, right? And that eventually the chief rabbi decided that there should be a memorial day that's specifically designated for the Shoah, as opposed to lumping it together with Tisha B'Av. And of course, you know, some Jews were really offended. Like, what do you mean? This Tisha B'Av is the day to commemorate all of these tragedies. Why would you have something separate? And I'm actually in agreement that there should be another day of commemoration, because the Shoah is sui generis. It's beyond anything that's ever occurred to humanity, and therefore is deserving of its own unique day of commemoration.
Yeah, I heard explanation before on how the rabbis were saying that if we have to observe every tragedy that happened to the Jewish people at the date that it happened, we will have to fast every day of the year. So the idea was to find a reason to connect the tragedy to Tisha B'Av, and that's why it was that philosophy was brought once again at the time of discussing a memorial for the Holocaust. And I'm wondering if 100 or 200 years from now that will ever happen, that something is going to be connected. Because I remember when the discussion started, they realized that Tisha B'Av was not so popular. It was kind of, I guess, even in these days, it's not the most popular day of the Jewish calendar. So perhaps by connecting it with the Holocaust will be a way to make Tisha B'Av meaningful once again for another generation, even for people who don't care much about the temple, let's put it that way. It will still be a reason to observe Tisha B'Av. But it happens with other Jewish festivals. If you think about it, something like Shavuot, for example. The fact that the rabbi said, this is the day of the revelation of the Torah, I believe was an attempt to save the date. Because without the temple, what else do you have in Shavuot? Without the temple and without agriculture, let's put it that way. It's a dead date. So, but the fact that it was connected to the giving of Torah, then now we have a reason to celebrate Shavuot with Kavanah. Same thing with, let's say, Shmini Atzeret, that we celebrate the completion of Torah, right? And there were attempts in history to save from a certain death some important dates of the Jewish calendar. So, yeah, interesting concept.
Yeah, I would just add to it, there's every holiday, every day of and days of commemoration have different glosses that have been added to them, different layers, and I think that's a way of preserving the different traditions that existed, right? And that's a beauty of Judaism. It's it allows each individual Jew to come at this from a place that's meaningful to her, to that individual Jew, in a way that may not speak to somebody else, right?
Well, I think lots of things to think about on this Tisha B'Av, and I believe that was the goal of this panel. Just to realize that sometimes there is no right or wrong. There is a desire to preserve the holiness of Tisha B'Av and to make it meaningful. So we don't feel that we have to do it because somebody told us to do it, but it's an opportunity for each one of us to make this day a meaningful day. And I think we achieved that by all the comments. And so I thank you so much for taking it.
I was going to answer one of the questions in the chat box, if I might.
Yes, which one?
I think Karen Farkas asked the question regarding the percentage of Jews killed with the Second Temple.
Yeah,
I don't know the specific. I don't know the specific percentages, but I do. My understanding when I was reading about the Bar Kokhba rebellion is that that's when they raised the temple afterwards. My understanding is that 500,000 civilians were killed in Israel at that time, and this is about 135 CE, about 65 years after the Second Temple. I think this is just, I'm not sure if it's a question of percentages, but it's bad and bad and bad, every one of these things that happened. So, but these were not just the consequences of the destruction of a building, but military conquest and eradication were parts of all of those things. Very similar stylistically to what happened with the Holocaust in many ways.
Yeah, I have to ask.
I don't know the Jewish populations.
Sorry, I'm now just a little distracted. There's somebody in the chat box whose name is his sibling. Does that mean that's one of your siblings, Alan?
No,
that's actually Matthew Leibels.
That's Terry Kushner from Toronto. Come on.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it is. Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay. For some reason, I thought it was Matthew's. It's not.
Former congregant at Congregation Sherry Zedek. Now she's in Toronto, and she still tunes in to all our services and events. So, hi, Terry.
That's great.
Yes. Well, I have to thank you, rabbis, for being here, and also thank everyone for participating. I like when people use the chat to communicate. It feels that what we say actually matters. They're paying attention. So it's great. It's great to have that feeling. And by the way, for those of you who missed the reading of Megillat Echa, the Book of Lamentation, is going to be rebroadcast at 12 noon Central Time in about 20 minutes. Okay? So that's a good opportunity to finish this panel. So I will have time to go and set that up. And so everybody we
could be here for a while otherwise. Good move.
Yeah. Very nice. Well done, Rabbi Mas. Thank you for doing
this. Thank you all. Yeah, thank you so much for all the technology support, and to Rena for all of her help as well, and Sharet Tzedek for creating the graphics for this. Much appreciated.
That was Robert Didich who created the graphics.
Rena's the one who Rena opened the door for us, so thank her for her role in taking this on. Very much appreciated.
Well, so thank you everyone. and I hope you're going to have a meaningful experience for this Tisha B'Av. And remember, we are always here for you. We are the Council of Rabbis of Winnipeg, and we have Temple Shalom, Congregation Etz Chaim, Congregation Sher Zedek, and Adas Yeshurun Herzliya here to serve you. So it's always good to belong to Shul, be part of building a next generation of Jewish Winnipeg, and we can do it all together. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.